The rain began before sunrise. It fell softly over the rolling hills of Hampshire, washing the dust from ancient stone walls and turning the gardens of Beaumont House into a sea of glistening emerald. Beyond the towering iron gates, rows of ancient oak trees swayed gently in the wind, their golden autumn leaves drifting across the long carriage drive like forgotten memories. For nearly 300 years, Beaumont House had stood as a symbol of honor. Kings had visited its halls. Generals had celebrated victories beneath its painted ceilings. Poets had written of its beauty. To the people of England, the Beaumont name meant dignity, generosity, and unwavering strength. Yet magnificent houses often hid their deepest sorrows behind the grandest doors. Inside the vast library, where thousands of leather-bound books lined towering shelves from polished oak floor to carved ceiling, a single candle burned beside an aging mahogany desk. Alexander Beaumont stood before the fire with one hand resting against the mantel. At 29 years old, he carried the title of Duke with quiet confidence. He was taller than most men, broad-shouldered from years spent riding across the estate, with dark brown hair that curled slightly whenever the weather turned damp. His gray eyes, however, betrayed the burden he carried. They were the eyes of a man who had not truly rested since the day he buried his father. The silence in the room felt heavier than the rain outside. Across the desk sat Mr. Edwin Carlyle, the Beaumont family's solicitor for nearly 40 years. He had delivered births, marriages, inheritances, and deaths to 4 generations of the family. Never had he dreaded a conversation as much as this one. He adjusted his spectacles before unfolding another stack of papers. "Your Grace." Alexander never looked away from the fire. "How much?" The old solicitor hesitated. "Every estate combined now carries debts exceeding £180,000. The room became impossibly still. Even the rain seemed to fade into silence. Alexander slowly closed his eyes. £180,000. The number was almost beyond comprehension. Enough to bankrupt most noble families in England. His father had hidden everything. The failing vineyards, the failed shipping investments, the loans borrowed simply to pay older loans. Year after year, the Beaumont fortune had crumbled while society continued believing they remained among the richest families in Britain. Alexander had inherited the title. He had inherited the land. He had inherited the responsibility. He had also inherited ruin. Mr. Carlyle continued quietly. "The London townhouse has already been mortgaged." Alexander nodded once. "I expected as much. The northern farms no longer produce enough grain to support themselves." "I know. The vineyards lost nearly half their harvest this year. I've seen the reports." The solicitor looked down at the final document resting alone on the desk. "There is one final matter." Alexander finally turned. His expression remained calm, but something in his eyes warned the old man to choose his words carefully. "My grandfather established a private inheritance fund nearly 30 years ago. I've heard of it. It remains untouched." Hope flickered, if only for an instant. "How much?" "Nearly £200,000. Alexander stared at him. "Enough. It would erase every debt, save every tenant, protect every servant, restore Beaumont House." His pulse quickened. "Then why haven't we claimed it?" Mr. Carlyle's shoulders sank. "Because your grandfather attached a condition." Alexander's hope disappeared almost as quickly as it had arrived. "What condition?" The solicitor swallowed. "You must be married before the first snowfall." Silence. Alexander almost laughed. Instead, he simply looked toward the rain-covered windows. "My grandfather attempted to arrange my future from beyond his grave. He believed family was the foundation of every great house." Alexander said nothing. "There is another clause." "I suspected there would be. The marriage must be genuine." He frowned. "What does that mean?" "The trustees reserve the right to investigate any union made solely for financial gain. So I cannot simply arrange a convenient marriage." "No." The old solicitor met his eyes. "You must convince both the law and society that you married for honorable reasons." Alexander let out a slow breath. Outside, thunder rolled across the countryside. His grandfather had always been a clever man. Even in death, the old Duke had anticipated exactly this possibility. He had wanted his grandson to choose a wife because of character, not wealth, not politics, not convenience. Character. Alexander looked again into the fire. Character. It was a beautiful ideal. Unfortunately, beautiful ideals rarely paid creditors. 20 miles away, the first rays of morning sunlight crept through the attic window of Ashford Manor. The room measured little more than 8 feet across. Its ceiling sloped so sharply that anyone taller than average had to duck near the walls. Rainwater stained one corner where the roof leaked every winter. The mattress was thin. The blankets had been patched more times than anyone could count. Yet to Clara Ashford, it was home. She woke before the bells. Always before the bells. Years of service had trained her body to rise long before dawn. She folded her blanket neatly, washed quickly in a small porcelain basin, and tied her chestnut-colored hair into a simple braid before slipping into her plain gray servant's dress. There was nothing remarkable about her appearance by society's standards. No expensive jewels, no silk gowns, no carefully arranged curls. Yet there was a quiet grace in the way she carried herself. Her warm brown eyes held a kindness that softened every room she entered. Her smile, though seldom seen by the nobility she served, had an extraordinary habit of making frightened children laugh and lonely elderly people feel remembered. Mrs. Holloway, the manor's elderly cook, often said the same thing. Some women enter a room because they wish to be noticed. She would smile while stirring enormous pots of soup. Clara enters a room because she notices everyone else. By 5 o'clock, the kitchens had already come alive. Bread baked inside enormous stone ovens. Tea kettles whistled. Young kitchen boys hurried between tables carrying sacks of flour nearly larger than themselves. Clara tied on her apron and immediately began kneading dough beside Mrs. Holloway. "You slept?" the old cook asked. "A little. You were reading again." Clara smiled guiltily. "Only 1 chapter." Mrs. Holloway laughed. "My dear, every time you say 1 chapter, sunrise arrives before you close the book." Clara lowered her eyes. "I lose track of time." "I know." The old woman reached beneath the counter and quietly handed her a small package wrapped in cloth. "I found another one." Clara carefully unfolded the bundle. Inside rested an old leather-bound novel. Its cover was worn almost smooth. Several pages were loose. To anyone else, it would have been rubbish. To Clara, it was treasure. Her face lit with genuine joy. "Oh, Mrs. Holloway." It was headed for the fireplace. Clara gently ran her fingers across the faded cover. "Persuasion." Mrs. Holloway smiled. "I thought you might rescue it." "I always will." The elderly cook watched her for a moment. "You know." She lowered her voice. "I've served noble families for 43 years. I know. I've met ladies who owned libraries larger than churches." She nodded toward the book in Clara's hands. "Not one of them loved books the way you do." Clara laughed softly. "I suppose that's because they never feared losing them." Mrs. Holloway's smile faded. "My dear," she said quietly, "I sometimes think you were born for a different life." Clara carefully closed the novel. "I used to believe that. And now." She looked toward the kitchen window where the first rays of sunlight illuminated the gardens beyond. "Now I think we honor life best by becoming the kindest version of ourselves, wherever we happen to be." Mrs. Holloway looked at the young woman with something close to wonder. "You truly believe that?" "I have to." She smiled gently. "Otherwise, kindness would belong only to the fortunate." The old cook reached across the table and squeezed her hand. "No," she whispered. "I think fortune belongs to those who choose kindness." The great bell of Ashford Manor suddenly rang through the halls. Breakfast service had begun. Neither woman realized that before another fortnight had passed, the quiet servant standing beside a bread table would become the most talked-about woman in all of England. And a duke who believed his heart had long ago become incapable of love. was about to discover that destiny often entered great houses wearing the plainest clothes. The breakfast bell echoed through every corridor of Ashford Manor, and within moments the peaceful rhythm of the kitchen transformed into organized chaos. Servants hurried through narrow passageways carrying silver trays, porcelain teapots, and baskets filled with warm bread. Footmen polished glasses until they reflected the chandeliers overhead. Housemaids rushed to prepare guest chambers before the household awoke. Clara slipped naturally into the flow of activity. She balanced a silver tray upon one hand while carefully arranging fresh roses in crystal vases with the other. Every movement was practiced, graceful, and unhurried. She had long ago learned that panic created mistakes, while patience often prevented them. As she crossed the eastern hallway, two younger maids stepped aside to let her pass. One waited until Clara was several paces ahead before whispering loudly enough to be heard. "There goes the scholar." The other laughed. "Be careful. She'll probably correct your grammar before polishing your boots." Several servants nearby chuckled. Clara continued walking as though she hadn't heard a word. She had discovered years ago that silence often defeated cruelty better than arguments ever could. Still, words had a way of lingering long after they were spoken. By the time she reached the morning room, Lady Margaret Hawthorne had already taken her breakfast. The widow sat beside a large window overlooking the gardens, reading correspondence while sipping tea from delicate china. Without looking up, she spoke. "Good morning, Clara." "Good morning, my lady. The roses are lovely." Mrs. Holloway said the yellow ones opened before dawn. Lady Margaret finally looked toward the arrangement and smiled. "They remind me of my husband's garden." There was sadness in her voice. Lord Hawthorne had passed away 6 years earlier, leaving Lady Margaret to manage the estate alone. Though respected throughout the county, she had never fully recovered from the loss. "My husband believed flowers revealed a person's character." Clara tilted her head. "How so?" "He always said roses taught patience." Lady Margaret gently touched one of the blossoms. "You cannot force them to bloom." Clara smiled. "I think people are much the same." The older woman studied her thoughtfully. "You always have an answer. I only have thoughts, which many people mistake for answers." A faint smile crossed both their faces. Lady Margaret folded the letter she had been reading. "Walk with me, my lady. I've spent enough mornings alone." Clara hesitated. Servants were rarely invited to stroll beside their employers. Seeing her uncertainty, Lady Margaret smiled kindly. "I promise London will survive if breakfast arrives 1 minute later." They stepped into the gardens together. Morning dew shimmered across the lawns like scattered diamonds. Beyond the hedges, gardeners trimmed rose bushes while birds sang from ancient elm trees. For several minutes, neither woman spoke. Finally, Lady Margaret broke the silence. "Do you ever resent this life?" Clara looked puzzled. "My lady, serving others." She glanced toward the manor. "You are intelligent. You read constantly. You speak better than many ladies I know. Have you never wished circumstances had been different?" Clara considered the question carefully. "I used to. And now, I've learned something." Lady Margaret waited. "My father often said that life asks 2 questions. What were they? The first is," she looked toward the sky, "what has happened to you? And the second? What will you do because of it?" Lady Margaret remained silent. "My father died when I was 15. Clara continued softly. "My mother passed away 2 winters later. There was no money, no family willing to take me in. So I entered service." She smiled gently. "I could spend every day grieving the life I lost. Or," she picked up a fallen leaf from the path, "I could become someone who eases another person's grief." Lady Margaret felt her throat tighten. "You speak like a philosopher." Clara laughed. "I speak like a servant who has had many hours to think while polishing silver." The older woman laughed as well. Then her smile slowly faded. "My dear," she spoke almost reluctantly, "there is something you should know." Clara turned toward her. "The Duke of Beaumont called this morning." A flicker of surprise crossed Clara's face. He did. He asked whether he might visit the estate tomorrow. Clara lowered her eyes. I see. Lady Margaret watched her carefully. He did not ask to inspect the property. He asked after you. Silence settled between them. I thought you deserved to hear it from me rather than through gossip. Clara's heart beat just a little faster. She scarcely knew the Duke. They had spoken only briefly, yet there had been something sincere in his manner. Something entirely unlike the proud nobleman who rarely noticed servants unless giving instructions. I don't understand. Lady Margaret gave a knowing smile. I believe he wishes to thank the girl who saved his life. Clara looked toward the distant hills. It was so long ago. Some debts are never forgotten. At Beaumont House, Alexander stood in the estate chapel. Sunlight streamed through stained-glass windows, painting brilliant colors across the stone floor. His grandfather had built the chapel decades earlier. Simple, peaceful, free from unnecessary grandeur. Alexander often came here when difficult decisions weighed upon him. He sat alone in the front pew. The old letter rested in his hands once again. A great house is not saved by gold. It is saved by character. Those words refused to leave his thoughts. He had spent the previous evening reviewing the names Samuel Whitmore had delivered. Farmers, doctors, teachers, blacksmiths, ordinary people whose lives his grandfather had quietly changed. None owed him money. None expected rewards. They simply remembered kindness. Alexander slowly realized something that unsettled him. His grandfather's greatest inheritance had never been wealth. It had been reputation. Not the reputation admired in London's glittering ballrooms, but the one carried quietly in villages where grateful people never forgot a generous hand. A knock echoed gently against the chapel door. His longtime steward, Thomas Graves, stepped inside. You wish to see me, Your Grace? Alexander nodded. How many servants work at Beaumont House? Thomas blinked. I beg your pardon? The exact number. The steward thought for a moment. 68. And how many have families? Most of them. Alexander looked toward the stained-glass window depicting St. George. If Beaumont House fails, he spoke quietly, what becomes of them? Thomas hesitated. They would seek employment elsewhere. And if they cannot? The steward had no answer. Alexander rose slowly. I've spent weeks worrying about losing land. He folded his grandfather's letter. I should have been worrying about losing people. Thomas smiled faintly. The old Duke would have been pleased to hear you say that. Alexander looked toward the chapel doors. Prepare my carriage. We're traveling to Ashford Manor. Thomas raised an eyebrow. Today. Immediately. The steward bowed. Very good, Your Grace. As he hurried away, Alexander remained in the quiet chapel for one final moment. He did not yet know why destiny had placed Clara Ashford back into his life after nearly 20 years. But for the first time since inheriting his title, the future no longer felt entirely dark. And somewhere beyond the rolling hills of Hampshire, a young servant was unknowingly about to step onto a path that would forever change both their lives. Alexander's carriage rolled through the countryside beneath a sky of drifting gray clouds. The horses maintained a steady pace along the winding road, their hooves striking the damp earth with a comforting rhythm. Fields stretched toward the horizon, dotted with grazing sheep and scattered farmhouses whose chimneys released thin ribbons of smoke into the cool afternoon air. Inside the carriage, Alexander held his grandfather's letter once more. He had read it so many times in the past 24 hours that he no longer needed the words before him. They had settled deep within his thoughts. Choose goodness. Such simple advice. Yet it had become the most difficult choice of his life. His steward, Thomas Graves, sat opposite him. Your Grace, he said carefully. May I ask you something? Alexander looked up. Of course. Do you intend to repay Miss Ashford for saving your life? Alexander considered the question. I've asked myself that since yesterday. And I don't believe a life can ever truly be repaid. Thomas nodded. I agree. But gratitude can still be shown. Alexander looked through the rain-speckled window. That's what troubles me. Thomas frowned. What troubles you? I cannot decide whether I'm traveling to thank her. He paused. Or because I simply wish to see her again. The steward smiled almost imperceptibly. I suspect those are two very different journeys. At Ashford Manor, Clara had spent the afternoon preparing the blue drawing room. Lady Margaret often received distinguished visitors there. Every chair had to be perfectly aligned, every painting carefully dusted, every flower arranged with quiet elegance. Clara replaced a vase of fading roses with fresh white lilies. She stepped back to admire the arrangement. Not perfect. She moved one blossom slightly to the left. Now it felt balanced. She smiled to herself. You always notice the smallest details. The voice startled her. She turned to find Lady Margaret standing in the doorway. I hope I haven't disturbed you, my lady. Not at all. Lady Margaret walked toward the flowers. I've watched you arrange flowers for years. She pointed toward the vase. You never seek symmetry. Clara looked surprised. No, you seek harmony. Clara laughed softly. I've never thought about it that way. I have. Lady Margaret gently touched one of the lilies. Beautiful things rarely need to match. They simply need to belong together. Before Clara could reply, the sound of carriage wheels echoed across the front drive. Both women instinctively looked toward the window. A black carriage bearing the Beaumont crest slowly came to a halt before the entrance. Lady Margaret smiled knowingly. It seems your visitor has arrived. Clara felt her heartbeat quicken. I should return to the kitchens. Lady Margaret gently touched her arm. No, my lady. He came to see you. Clara hesitated. I am only a servant. Lady Margaret met her eyes. And yet he came. Alexander stepped from the carriage just as the rain stopped. A cool breeze carried the scent of wet earth and blooming lavender across the estate. The front door opened before he reached the steps. Lady Margaret greeted him warmly. Your Grace. My lady. You honor my house. The honor is mine. After exchanging polite greetings, they entered the drawing room. Tea had already been prepared. For several minutes they spoke about estate matters, the recent harvest, and mutual acquaintances in London. Finally, Alexander asked the question he had come to ask. May I speak with Miss Ashford? Lady Margaret smiled. I thought you might. She rang a small silver bell. Moments later, the door opened quietly. Clara entered carrying a fresh teapot. She curtsied gracefully. Your Grace. Alexander stood. For a brief moment, neither spoke. The room felt strangely quiet. Lady Margaret noticed. I suddenly remember I promised to inspect the conservatory. She rose from her chair. I shall return shortly. Without waiting for either of them to protest, she disappeared through the adjoining doors. Alexander almost smiled. The older woman had engineered their privacy with remarkable subtlety. Clara carefully poured fresh tea into his cup. I hope your journey wasn't unpleasant. It was peaceful. She placed the teapot down. I'm glad. Another silence followed. Not uncomfortable, simply unfamiliar. Alexander finally spoke. I realized yesterday. Yes. I never properly thanked you. She looked puzzled. For what? He couldn't help smiling. You truly don't remember? I remember saving a frightened boy. Her eyes sparkled with gentle amusement. I don't remember expecting thanks. Alexander laughed. I deserved that. She smiled. You were very stubborn. I still am. I noticed. Both laughed quietly. The ease between them surprised them both. Alexander reached into his coat pocket. I've carried something for 19 years. He carefully placed a faded blue ribbon upon the table. Clara stared at it. For several long seconds she didn't move. Finally, she reached out with trembling fingers. I thought this had been lost. It tore from your dress. She gently touched the worn fabric. My mother sewed that ribbon onto my favorite dress. Alexander watched emotion fill her eyes. You remember. Every moment. She looked down at the ribbon. It was the last dress my mother ever made. Alexander's heart sank. I didn't know. How could you? She smiled sadly. She died that winter. The room fell silent once more. Alexander realized the ribbon had meant far more to Clara than he had ever imagined. I'm sorry. She shook her head gently. Don't be. She looked up. You kept it. I never understood why. I think. She smiled through glistening eyes. Perhaps some promises are made before we even know we've made them. Those words lingered between them. Alexander suddenly understood something that had escaped him for years. He had never forgotten the girl who saved his life. Not because of the rescue alone, but because, even as a child, she had shown a courage and kindness he had never encountered again. Before he could speak, hurried footsteps echoed from the entrance hall. A young footman burst into the room, breathless. My lady, your grace. Lady Margaret returned immediately. What is it? The servant swallowed hard. There's been an accident. Everyone stood. One of the tenant cottages caught fire. Clara's face turned pale. The Wilson family? The footman nodded. The roof collapsed. Without a second's hesitation, Clara was already moving toward the door. Alexander called after her. Where are you going? She looked back, determination filling her eyes. To help. Then she ran. Alexander watched her disappear into the rain-soaked afternoon. Without another word, he turned to Thomas. Ready the horses. Thomas smiled knowingly. At once, your grace. Alexander followed Clara out into the storm. Neither of them knew that the fire waiting in the village would become the moment that changed not only their own destinies, but the future of the Beaumont name forever. The rain had turned fierce by the time Alexander's carriage reached the village. Dark smoke climbed into the gray sky, visible long before they arrived. The scent of burning timber filled the air, and frightened voices echoed across the fields. The Wilson cottage stood at the edge of the village, its thatched roof consumed by bright orange flames. Neighbors formed desperate lines, passing heavy buckets from the village well, while others struggled to pull furniture and livestock away from the fire before it spread to the nearby homes. Alexander stepped from the carriage before it had fully stopped. Thomas, he shouted, gather every able-bodied man. Tear down the fence between these cottages. If the flames spread, we'll lose the entire row. Yes, your grace. Without hesitation, Alexander removed his coat and joined the villagers, carrying bucket after bucket toward the burning house. Across the muddy road, Clara was already kneeling beside an elderly woman wrapped in a wool blanket. It's all gone, the woman sobbed. Everything my husband built. Clara gently took both of her trembling hands. Look at me, Mrs. Wilson. The older woman lifted tear-filled eyes. Your husband built more than a cottage. She glanced toward the frightened grandchildren huddled nearby. He built a family. The woman looked toward the children and began to cry even harder. They're safe because of you, Clara whispered. That is what matters today. The elderly woman leaned forward, embracing Clara as tears streamed down her weathered face. Alexander saw the moment from across the yard. While others fought the fire, Clara fought despair. Both battles were equally important. A young boy suddenly came running toward them, his face pale with terror. Miss Clara. She stood immediately. What is it? My sister. He pointed toward the burning cottage. Emily's still inside. Every conversation stopped. Every face turned toward the flames. Mrs. Wilson gasped. No! My granddaughter! A deafening crack echoed through the air as part of the roof collapsed. Several villagers instinctively stepped backward. It is too late, one man whispered. No one could survive in there. Clara's eyes searched the burning windows. Then she heard it. Faint cry, barely audible above the roar of the fire. A little girl's voice. Without thinking, Clara ran. Clara! Alexander's voice thundered across the yard. She ignored him. She reached the front door just as flames burst through one of the windows. Smoke poured into the sky. She covered her mouth with the edge of her apron and disappeared inside. Alexander's heart nearly stopped. No! He sprinted after her. Your Grace! Thomas shouted. The roof is coming down. Alexander never slowed. Inside, the cottage was almost impossible to see. Smoke filled every room. Burning beams groaned overhead. The heat stung his eyes. "Clara!" he shouted. No answer. Only coughing. Then, a small voice. "I'm here." He followed the sound into what had once been a bedroom. Clara had found the little girl. Emily couldn't have been older than 6. A fallen beam blocked the doorway. Clara struggled desperately to lift it. "It's too heavy," she gasped. Alexander reached them seconds later. Together they forced their shoulders beneath the charred timber. It refused to move. Alexander gritted his teeth. Again. Both pushed with every ounce of strength they possessed. The beam shifted. Just enough. Clara quickly pulled Emily through the opening. Then another terrible sound echoed above them. The ceiling. Alexander looked up. The burning rafters had begun to collapse. "We have to go." Smoke swallowed the hallway. He lifted Emily into his arms. Clara stumbled behind him, coughing violently. The front doorway appeared through the smoke like a distant light. Only a few more steps. Then, the floor beneath Alexander cracked. His foot plunged through weakened boards. He nearly fell. Emily cried out. Without hesitation, Clara grabbed his arm with both hands. "Don't let go." Together they pulled him free. Moments later they burst through the doorway just as the roof collapsed behind them with a deafening roar. The watching villagers erupted into relieved cheers. Mrs. Wilson ran forward, embracing her granddaughter so tightly the little girl could barely breathe. "My sweet Emily. I thought I'd lost you." Emily pointed toward Clara. "She came for me." The old woman looked at Clara with tears streaming down her face. "You saved her." Clara shook her head. "We all did." Mrs. Wilson turned to Alexander. "And your grace." The Duke simply smiled. "The brave one was already inside before I arrived." Every pair of eyes turned toward Clara. The villagers had always respected her. Now they looked at her with something even greater. Admiration. One elderly farmer removed his cap. Then another. Soon every man standing in the muddy road had uncovered his head. Not because she was noble, not because she possessed wealth, but because courage demanded respect. Alexander noticed something remarkable. Not a single person saw a servant. They saw a hero. As the rain finally began to extinguish the last of the flames, Thomas approached quietly. "Your Grace." Alexander turned. "The neighboring cottages are safe." "Good. But the Wilson family has nowhere to live." Alexander looked toward the smoking ruins, then toward the frightened children huddled beneath blankets. He didn't hesitate. "They'll move into the West Guest House at Beaumont Estate." Thomas blinked. "The guest house, sir? It has stood empty for years." "But they'll remain there until a new home is built." Thomas smiled. "Very good, Your Grace." Clara overheard the conversation. "You would do that?" Alexander looked at her. "My grandfather once told me that an empty house is of no use to anyone." She smiled warmly. "I think he was a wise man." "He was." Alexander paused. "I hope to become half the man he was." Clara looked at him thoughtfully. "I believe," she said softly, "you're already trying." Those simple words lingered in his heart long after the fire had been extinguished. For the first time since inheriting Beaumont House, Alexander felt something he had almost forgotten. Hope. Yet from the far side of the village, hidden beneath the hood of a dark cloak, another pair of eyes had witnessed everything. Lady Eleanor Winthrop had come expecting to see a foolish duke embarrassing himself over a servant. Instead, she had watched him risk his own life to save her. Jealousy settled deep within her heart, and before climbing back into her carriage, she whispered words that chilled even her loyal maid. "If I cannot have the Duke." Her eyes remained fixed on Clara. "Then she shall never have him either." The carriage disappeared into the rain, carrying with it the beginning of a conspiracy that would soon shake every drawing room in London. Alexander remained in the village until long after sunset. The flames had finally surrendered to the relentless rain, leaving behind little more than blackened beams and drifting smoke. Villagers moved quietly through the ruins, gathering whatever belongings the fire had spared. Some carried scorched family portraits. Others searched for wedding rings among the ashes. Children clung to their parents, frightened by how quickly an ordinary afternoon had become a nightmare. Clara knelt beside Mrs. Wilson's youngest granddaughter, gently wrapping a clean bandage around the little girl's scraped knee. "There," she said with a reassuring smile. "You'll be chasing butterflies again before the week is over." Emily looked up at her. "Will our house come back?" Clara hesitated. She never believed in comforting people with lies. "No," she answered softly. "The house won't." The little girl's eyes filled with tears. "But—" Clara brushed a strand of soot-darkened hair from the child's forehead. "A home is more than walls." She pointed toward Emily's grandmother, who was helping her brother into a warm blanket. "As long as the people who love you are together," she smiled, "you can build another one." Emily threw her small arms around Clara's neck. "I want my new home to have flowers." Clara laughed quietly. "Then we'll plant the prettiest garden in Hampshire." Alexander watched the exchange from several yards away. Thomas approached carrying 2 steaming cups of tea. "I thought you might need this, Your Grace." Alexander accepted one without taking his eyes off Clara. "Thank you." Thomas followed his gaze. "Remarkable young woman." Alexander nodded almost absent-mindedly. "She speaks as though every word has been carefully chosen. Some people spend years learning how to impress others." Thomas smiled. "She seems more interested in comforting them." Alexander looked thoughtfully into his tea. "I've attended charity banquets where gentlemen donated thousands of pounds." He glanced toward Clara. "I've never seen anyone heal hearts the way she does." 3 days later, the village had already begun rebuilding. Carpenters from Beaumont estate arrived with wagons filled with timber. Stone masons volunteered their labor. Even neighboring farms sent workers without asking for payment. The news of the Duke's generosity spread quickly throughout the county. But an even greater story traveled alongside it. People spoke of the servant who had entered a burning cottage without hesitation. By the week's end, Clara had become something of a local legend. She disliked every moment of the attention. "People exaggerate," she insisted while helping Mrs. Holloway knead bread. Mrs. Holloway smiled knowingly. "They're grateful. They're mistaken. You saved a child. We saved a child." The old cook folded her arms. "You're impossible." Clara laughed. "So I've been told." Before either woman could continue, a young footman rushed into the kitchen. "Miss Clara." She looked up. "Yes, the Duke of Beaumont is here." Every conversation in the kitchen stopped. Even the bread seemed forgotten. Mrs. Holloway raised an eyebrow. "The Duke?" The footman nodded excitedly. "He's speaking with Lady Margaret." Then he lowered his voice. He asked if Miss Clara might join them. Several maids exchanged curious glances. One whispered under her breath, "Why would a duke wish to see a servant?" Another answered before Clara could, "Perhaps he's searching for a new housemaid." Quiet laughter spread through the room. Mrs. Holloway silenced them with a single look. Back to work. The kitchen immediately returned to motion. She turned toward Clara. "Go." Clara nervously wiped the flour from her hands. "I probably look dreadful." Mrs. Holloway gently adjusted the young woman's apron. "My dear." She smiled warmly. "Kindness has a way of making people forget flour." Alexander stood beside the drawing-room window when Clara entered. She curtsied politely. "You wish to see me, Your Grace?" He turned, carrying a small wooden box. "I did." Lady Margaret watched from her chair, pretending to read while secretly observing every word. Alexander placed the box upon the table. "This belonged to my grandmother." Clara looked surprised. "I don't understand." He opened the lid. Inside rested an elegant silver brooch shaped like a swallow in flight. Though simple compared to royal jewels, its craftsmanship was exquisite. "It was given to her by my grandfather when they were first married." Clara immediately stepped back. "I cannot accept something so valuable." "I hoped you would say that." She blinked. "You did." Alexander smiled faintly. It tells me I chose the right gift. He gently closed the box again. This is not payment. It isn't. No. He looked directly into her eyes. A life cannot be purchased. His voice became quieter. It is simply a token of gratitude from one family to another. Clara's expression softened. My family is gone. Alexander shook his head. I don't believe they are. She looked confused. He glanced toward Lady Margaret. You've spent years caring for people who needed you. The Wilson children. The orphanage. The servants. Mrs. Holloway. He smiled. I think you've built a family wherever you've gone. Clara felt tears threatening to form. No one had ever described her life that way before. Very carefully, she accepted the small wooden box. I'll treasure it. Alexander nodded. I hoped you would. For a moment, silence settled comfortably between them. Then Lady Margaret set her book aside. I believe this conversation requires fresh air. Both turned toward her. The gardens are particularly beautiful this afternoon. She smiled innocently. Why don't you walk together? Alexander almost laughed. Lady Margaret possessed all the subtlety of a marching band. Still, neither objected. The Beaumont gardens stretched across nearly 40 acres. Ancient hedges formed elegant pathways leading toward marble fountains and quiet lakes. Autumn had painted everything in shades of gold and crimson. Leaves drifted gently through the air as Alexander and Clara walked side by side. This place is beautiful, Clara whispered. My grandmother designed most of it. I can tell. What do you mean? Nothing here feels proud. Alexander smiled. I've never heard anyone describe a garden that way. She looked around thoughtfully. Some estates are built to impress visitors. She pointed toward a small wooden bench beneath an oak tree. But someone placed that bench where the afternoon sun stays longest. Alexander looked toward it. His grandfather had insisted on building it for elderly gardeners who needed to rest. He had never told anyone why. You notice everything. Clara smiled. I notice people. They continued walking until they reached the lake. Alexander stopped. The water shimmered beneath the afternoon light. This is where it happened. Clara nodded. I remember. I owe you my life. She looked at the gentle ripples crossing the surface. No, she smiled softly. I was simply fortunate enough to arrive before anyone else. Alexander shook his head. You've spent your entire life saying the remarkable things you do are ordinary. Perhaps they are. They're not. He turned to face her fully. Clara. She looked up. If circumstances had been different. He hesitated. If you had been born into a noble family, she interrupted him with surprising firmness. I would still be the same person. Alexander stared at her. She continued gently. My clothes might change. My title might change. But if kindness depends upon privilege, she smiled sadly, then it was never kindness at all. Alexander had no answer, because deep inside he knew she was right. And as they stood beside the quiet lake where fate had first brought them together nearly 20 years before, he realized something that frightened him more than the debts-threatening Beaumont house. He no longer looked forward to seeing Clara because he owed her gratitude. He looked forward to seeing her because she made the world seem gentler whenever she was near. Unseen from the far side of the gardens, a servant hurried toward the manor carrying an urgent letter bearing the crimson seal of the Beaumont trustees. Inside that letter was news that would force Alexander to make the most difficult decision of his life. Alexander and Clara returned to Beaumont House just as the first evening lamps were being lit. Golden light spilled from the tall windows, warming the ancient stone walls that had watched over generations of the Beaumont family. For a brief moment, the estate seemed peaceful again. That illusion lasted only seconds. Thomas Graves hurried down the front steps, his normally calm expression replaced by unmistakable concern. Your Grace. Alexander immediately recognized the look on his steward's face. What has happened? Thomas held out a sealed envelope marked with dark red wax. It arrived from the trustees an hour ago. Alexander broke the seal. As his eyes moved across the page, the warmth drained from his face. Clara noticed the change immediately. Is something wrong? He folded the letter slowly. The deadline has changed. Thomas lowered his eyes. They've advanced the hearing. Alexander nodded grimly. I now have only 6 weeks before the inheritance expires. Clara looked confused. I thought you had until winter. So did I. The trustees discovered several creditors preparing legal action. He looked toward the manor. If I cannot satisfy the conditions before the hearing. His voice became almost a whisper. Everything my family owns will be sold. The weight of those words settled heavily over the courtyard. Clara understood at once. This was no longer merely a financial inconvenience. Dozens of servants would lose their homes. Hundreds of tenant families could lose their livelihoods. An entire community depended upon one man's impossible decision. Lady Margaret stepped outside after hearing the conversation. Surely there must be another solution. Alexander smiled sadly. If there is, I haven't found it. He thanked Thomas and quietly excused himself, disappearing into the house before anyone could stop him. Clara watched him leave. For the first time since meeting him again, she saw not the Duke admired by society. She saw a lonely man carrying responsibilities far too heavy for one person. Late that evening, Beaumont House had fallen silent. The servants retired to their quarters. The candles burned low. Only one room remained lit. The library. Alexander sat alone before a desk covered in ledgers, estate maps, and unpaid invoices. No matter how many times he calculated the numbers, they never changed. He closed another account book in frustration. A gentle knock interrupted the silence. Come in. Thomas entered carrying a tray with tea. You've not eaten since breakfast. I'm not hungry. Thomas placed the tray on the desk anyway. You'll think more clearly if you do. Alexander smiled faintly. You've been saying that since I was 12. And you've ignored me for just as long. For a moment they both laughed. Faded quickly. Thomas hesitated before speaking again. May I offer an opinion? You usually do. The steward nodded. You could solve this tomorrow. Alexander looked up. How? Lady Eleanor Winthrop. Silence. Her family possesses one of the largest fortunes in England. I know. She wishes to marry you. I know. Together, your debts would disappear. Alexander stared into the fire. It would be the sensible choice. Thomas said nothing. Alexander continued quietly. But every time I imagine standing beside her at the altar, he shook his head. It feels as though I would be selling something that cannot be bought. The heart. Alexander smiled sadly. Perhaps. Thomas remained thoughtful. And what of Miss Ashford? Alexander looked up sharply. What about her? You've smiled more in the past week than you have in the past 2 years. Alexander didn't answer. You look for her whenever she enters a room. Still silence. You remember details about her that most husbands fail to notice about their wives. Alexander finally sighed. I scarcely know her. Thomas smiled. Sometimes that matters less than we imagine. At Ashford Manor, Clara sat beside the small attic window with the novel Mrs. Holloway had rescued from the firewood pile. The words blurred before her eyes. She had read the same page 3 times without understanding a sentence. A soft knock sounded. Mrs. Holloway entered carrying 2 cups of warm milk. I suspected you weren't asleep. Clara smiled weakly. I wasn't. The old cook sat beside her. You're worried. Clara nodded. The Duke. I thought as much. He looked. She searched for the right word. Defeated. Mrs. Holloway stirred her drink quietly. Powerful people often hide their fears until they can hide them no longer. I wish I could help. The older woman looked at her carefully. My dear. She smiled gently. I think you've already helped more than you realize. How? I've never seen that young man laugh before. Clara looked surprised. You've known him? Only in passing. Mrs. Holloway nodded. His father employed my late husband for several harvest seasons. She looked into the distance. Even as a little boy, The Duke carried the world on his shoulders. Clara remembered the lonely expression on Alexander's face. He shouldn't have to bear it alone. Mrs. Holloway smiled knowingly. No one should. The following afternoon, London society gathered for Lady Winthrop's annual autumn garden reception. Music drifted across perfectly manicured lawns. Crystal fountains sparkled beneath the afternoon sun. Noble families strolled through rose gardens discussing politics, investments, and marriages. Lady Eleanor stood beneath a white pavilion, greeting guests with flawless elegance. Her smile was perfect. Her gown was exquisite. Yet behind every polite conversation, her thoughts remained fixed on one person, Clara Ashford. Across the lawn, two young ladies approached. "I heard the most amusing rumor," one whispered. "The Duke of Beaumont has become quite interested in a servant." Eleanor laughed softly. "A servant? So they say. The poor man must be grateful after she saved his life." The other lady lowered her voice. "They've been seen walking together." Eleanor's smile never wavered. How charming! Inside, jealousy burned hotter than any village fire. As soon as the women departed, she turned to her personal maid. "Emily." "Yes, my lady? I want to know everything about Clara Ashford. The servant. Every detail. Where she was born. Who her parents were. Who her friends are. If she has ever made a mistake." Eleanor's eyes hardened. "I intend to find it." The maid hesitated. "And if she hasn't?" Lady Eleanor slowly looked toward Beaumont House, barely visible beyond the distant hills. Then, her voice was cold enough to send a chill through the autumn air. "We shall give society one to believe." Far away, Clara was completely unaware that someone had just declared war on her reputation. And Alexander had no idea that, before the leaves fell from the trees, he would be forced to choose between saving his family's name or protecting the woman who had quietly become the center of his heart. Alexander stood alone on the balcony of Beaumont House long after the sun had disappeared beyond the hills. The estate stretched before him in the fading light. Fields that had fed generations of families. Woodlands where he had played as a child. Tenant cottages with small lamps glowing warmly through their windows. To anyone passing by, Beaumont House still appeared magnificent. Only Alexander knew how close it stood to collapse. He rested both hands on the stone railing. "If only grandfather had left instructions instead of riddles," he murmured. A familiar voice answered from behind him. "He did leave instructions." Alexander turned to find Samuel Whitmore, his grandfather's old friend, standing quietly in the doorway. "The trouble is," Samuel smiled gently, "they were meant for your heart, not your ledger." Alexander sighed. "I've spent my entire life trying to be practical. And how has that served you?" Alexander laughed bitterly. "I suppose the debt speaks for itself." Samuel walked onto the balcony beside him. "When your grandfather inherited this estate, there was almost nothing left." Alexander looked surprised. "What?" Samuel nodded. "You were never told?" "My father rarely spoke of those years. The Beaumont family nearly lost everything once before." Alexander stared at the old man. "How did they recover?" Samuel smiled toward the distant village. "Not through wealth." "Then how?" "Through trust." Alexander frowned. "I don't understand." "Your grandfather spent 20 years helping people before he ever asked for help himself." Samuel looked directly at him. "When hard times came, the people he had helped refused to let Beaumont fall." Alexander remembered the list Samuel had delivered. The 80 names. Ordinary people. Not investors. Not politicians. People whose lives his grandfather had quietly changed. "It wasn't the estate that made your grandfather great," Samuel said softly. "It was the people who believed in him." The following morning, Clara arrived at the village school carrying a basket of fresh bread. Every Saturday, she volunteered to help the schoolmistress teach reading to children whose parents worked long hours in the fields. As she entered, the children rushed toward her. "Miss Clara, you came. We saved your chair." She laughed as several small hands eagerly pulled her toward the classroom. The school consisted of a single room. Simple wooden desks, a black slate board, shelves lined with worn books that had been read so many times their bindings had nearly disappeared. Mrs. Abbott, the schoolmistress, smiled warmly. "They've been asking about you all week. I'm afraid I've spoiled them. I wish more people spoiled children with books." Clara unpacked the basket. Fresh bread, apples, several second-hand storybooks she had purchased from a traveling merchant. The children's eyes grew wide. "Are those for us?" "They are." A little boy carefully picked up one of the books. "I've never owned one before." Clara knelt beside him. "Then promise me something." "What?" "When you've finished reading it." She smiled. "Pass it to someone else." The boy nodded solemnly. "I promise." Standing unnoticed outside the open window, Alexander watched the entire exchange. He had come intending to invite Clara for a walk. Instead, he remained perfectly still. He listened as she patiently helped a nervous little girl sound out difficult words. He watched her celebrate every small success as though it were the greatest achievement in England. No audience, no applause, no expectation of recognition, simply kindness. Thomas quietly stepped beside him. "You've been standing here nearly 15 minutes. Alexander didn't take his eyes off Clara. "She spends her only free day teaching children." Thomas nodded. "So it would seem." Alexander smiled to himself. She could have asked life why it treated her unfairly. But instead, he watched Clara hug a child who had finally finished reading an entire page aloud. "She spends her time making sure no one else feels forgotten." Thomas remained silent. Some moments deserved silence. When the lesson ended, Clara stepped outside carrying the empty basket. She nearly dropped it in surprise. "Your Grace." Alexander smiled. "I hope I wasn't interrupting." "You were watching?" "I was." She looked slightly embarrassed. "The children exaggerate my lessons." "I don't think they do." They began walking along the narrow lane leading away from the school. For several minutes neither spoke. Finally Alexander broke the silence. "Why do you do it?" She looked at him. "Do what?" "Teach. You aren't paid. You give away books you can scarcely afford. You spend your only day of rest helping other people." Clara smiled gently. "My father couldn't read." Alexander looked surprised. "He couldn't." She shook her head. "He worked from the age of 7. There was never time. When I was little," she laughed softly, "he used to ask me to read the newspaper aloud every evening. I asked him once why he never learned." "What did he say?" She looked toward the distant fields. "He told me." Her voice became quieter. "Knowledge is the one treasure no one can steal." Alexander listened carefully. "So when I learned to read," she smiled, "I promised myself I'd share that treasure." Alexander felt an unexpected tightness in his chest. Everything Clara did seemed to come from love. Never pride, never obligation, simply love. As they continued walking, they reached an old stone bridge crossing a narrow stream. The water below reflected the bright autumn sky. Alexander stopped. "Clara." She turned. "There is something I need to tell you." His expression had grown serious. She sensed it immediately. "What is it?" "My family," he hesitated, "is in danger." She listened without interrupting. For generations people believed the Beaumont fortune was endless. It isn't. He explained everything. The debts, the inheritance, the deadline, the condition requiring him to marry. He held nothing back. When he finished, the only sound was the gentle rush of water beneath the bridge. Clara lowered her eyes. "So," she said quietly, "you must find a wife." Alexander nodded. "Yes." She forced a small smile. "I'm sure many ladies would be honored." He looked at her for a long moment. "They would marry the title, not the man." Clara's heart ached for him. "You deserve someone who sees both." Alexander met her gaze. "So do you." Neither of them realized how close they had drifted. Only inches separated them now. The afternoon breeze stirred the golden leaves around them. For one impossible moment, it seemed the entire world had grown still. Then the distant sound of galloping horses shattered the silence. A messenger raced toward them from Beaumont House, his horse covered in foam. He pulled sharply to a stop. "Your Grace!" Alexander stepped forward. "What is it?" The messenger handed him an official document bearing the royal crest. Alexander's expression changed the instant he read the first lines. Clara felt a chill. "What has happened?" He slowly lowered the letter. "The trustees have arranged a formal reception." He looked at her, disbelief written across his face. "In 2 weeks. They expect me to announce my future Duchess before all of London's nobility." The wind carried the last golden leaves from the trees as both of them realized. Time had just become their greatest enemy. The messenger remained on horseback, breathing heavily after riding through the countryside without stopping. "I was ordered to place this directly into your hands, Your Grace." Alexander folded the letter carefully. "Did the trustees send any further message?" "They instructed me to tell you only this." The young rider swallowed. "The future of Beaumont House will be decided before witnesses from every great family in England." Without another word, he tipped his hat and turned his horse back toward London. For several moments, neither Alexander nor Clara spoke. The cheerful murmur of the stream beneath the bridge suddenly seemed very far away. At last, Clara broke the silence. "They're forcing your hand." Alexander nodded. "They know every family in London will attend. If I arrive without announcing a bride," he looked toward the distant hills, "the creditors will assume Beaumont has fallen." Clara could hear the disappointment hidden beneath his calm voice. "And if you choose Lady Eleanor?" Alexander gave a tired smile. "My family survives. But," he looked directly at her, "I lose something I cannot replace." Clara quickly lowered her eyes. She knew exactly what he meant, yet neither of them dared speak the truth aloud. That evening, Beaumont House welcomed an unexpected visitor. Lady Eleanor Winthrop arrived in an elegant emerald carriage drawn by 4 white horses. Every servant recognized the Winthrop crest. Within moments, the entire household knew she had come. Alexander received her in the blue salon. She entered with effortless confidence, dressed in deep green silk embroidered with tiny pearls that shimmered beneath the candlelight. She curtsied gracefully. "Your Grace, Lady Eleanor, I hope my visit isn't inconvenient." "You are always welcome." She smiled pleasantly. "I heard about the trustees." Alexander looked surprised. "News travels quickly." "In London." She laughed softly. "Nothing remains a secret for long." Tea was served. For several minutes they spoke politely about the coming reception. Then Eleanor carefully set down her cup. "There is a solution." Alexander already knew what was coming. "You mean marriage?" "I do." She leaned forward. "Our families have known one another for generations. Our estates would be united. The creditors would withdraw immediately. The trustees would have no objections." She paused. "I believe we would make an admirable partnership." Alexander remained silent. She interpreted his silence as uncertainty. "My father has already approved. The settlement would be completed before the reception." Still, Alexander said nothing. Finally, he answered with quiet honesty. "You deserve a husband who marries you because he loves you." For the first time that evening, Lady Eleanor's smile faltered. "And if affection grows later? I cannot promise what I do not feel." The words were gentle, but unmistakable. A long silence settled over the room. At last, Eleanor rose. "I appreciate your honesty." She curtsied once more. "I hope," her voice remained perfectly composed, "that your heart proves as practical as your conscience." Alexander escorted her to the entrance. Only after her carriage disappeared beyond the gates did Eleanor allow her expression to change. Her pleasant smile vanished. Her eyes became cold. "So," she whispered, "he truly refuses me." Her maid looked uneasy. "My lady, this isn't because of me." Eleanor stared through the carriage window. "It's because of her." The maid hesitated. Miss Ashford. Eleanor nodded slowly. I've seen the way he looks at that servant. Her gloved hand tightened until the fabric creased. If she disappeared, she spoke almost to herself. He would have no choice. The following morning, Clara arrived at the orphanage carrying fresh blankets sewn by the women of Ashford village. The children greeted her with delighted cries. Miss Clara, you came back. One little girl proudly held up a page covered in careful handwriting. I finished my letters. Clara knelt beside her. You certainly did. I'm so proud of you. The child beamed. Just then, the orphanage's matron approached. Miss Ashford. Yes, Mrs. Evans? A gentleman came asking about you yesterday. Clara looked puzzled. A gentleman? He claimed to be a solicitor. He asked many questions. What kind of questions? Mrs. Evans frowned. Where you were born, who your parents were, whether anyone still remembers your childhood. A strange uneasiness settled over Clara. Did he say why? No. He simply took notes. Clara forced a smile. I'm sure it's nothing, but deep inside, it did not feel like nothing. Across London, inside the Winthrop townhouse, Lady Eleanor sat before a roaring fire. A thin man in a dark coat stood across from her. His name was Mr. Bartholomew Finch. For years, he had quietly gathered information for wealthy families. Sometimes the information protected reputations. Other times, it destroyed them. Well? Eleanor asked. Finch opened his notebook. Clara Ashford, 24 years old. Parents deceased. Entered service at 15. No debts. No criminal record. No scandals. Eleanor frowned. Nothing. Quite the opposite. He turned another page. Every person I interviewed praised her. The school. The orphanage. The villagers. Even former employers. Eleanor's patience began to wear thin. There must be something. Finch remained thoughtful. There is. She leaned forward. What? Her birth records. What about them? They're missing. Silence. Eleanor's eyes narrowed. Missing? I searched parish records. They disappear for nearly 3 years. And then suddenly, he tapped the page. She appears again. Lady Eleanor slowly smiled. Not a warm smile, a dangerous one. So there is a mystery. Finch nodded. I believe so. She stood and walked toward the window overlooking London. Find out who she really is. And if the truth cannot ruin her. She looked back over her shoulder. We'll make certain society believes a different one. Unaware of the storm gathering around her, Clara walked home beneath the golden evening sky. She paused beside the small stone bridge where she and Alexander had spoken the day before. The stream flowed peacefully beneath it. She rested her hands on the weathered railing. His words echoed in her thoughts. You deserve someone who sees both. She smiled sadly. No one had ever looked at her the way Alexander had. Not because she was beautiful. Not because she had saved his life. But because he listened. He noticed. He cared. She knew such feelings were impossible. He was a duke. She was a servant. The distance between their worlds could not be measured in miles. Only in centuries of tradition. So why did her heart refuse to believe it? As the last rays of sunlight disappeared beyond the hills, footsteps approached behind her. She turned, expecting to see a villager. Instead, Alexander stood there, slightly out of breath, as though he had searched half the countryside to find her. Clara. His voice was unusually serious. I've been looking everywhere. A sudden flutter of worry crossed her face. What happened? He stepped closer. There is something I need to ask you. He paused, gathering his courage. It may be the most important question I ever ask. Clara's heart began to race. She had no idea that the words Alexander was about to speak would change both of their lives forever. Alexander stood motionless on the old stone bridge. The fading sunlight caught the gentle ripples beneath them, painting the water in shades of gold and amber. A cool breeze stirred the branches overhead, sending a shower of crimson leaves drifting around them. For a long moment, neither spoke. Clara searched his face. She had never seen him look so uncertain. Alexander Beaumont, the Duke who faced bankers, politicians, and powerful noblemen without hesitation, now struggled to find words before a servant. He gave a quiet laugh. I rehearsed this speech all the way here. She smiled softly. And now you've forgotten it? Completely. Her smile widened. I find that difficult to believe. I assure you it's true. The tension between them eased for just a moment. Then Alexander became serious once more. Clara. He took a slow breath. You know the position I'm in. She nodded. I do. You know my family is running out of time. Yes. And you know that every noble family in England expects me to announce my future wife at the trustees' reception. She lowered her eyes. I know. Another silence followed. Finally, Alexander spoke the words that had weighed upon his heart for days. I need your help. Clara looked up. My help? Yes. She looked confused. I don't understand. Alexander stepped closer. The trustees believe they can judge a man's character by the woman he chooses. He smiled sadly. They're probably right. Clara waited. I've spent the last week asking myself what kind of Duchess Beaumont house truly deserves. He looked directly into her eyes. The answer has always been the same. Her heartbeat quickened. Someone kind. Someone honest. Someone who sees people before titles. His voice grew quieter. Someone exactly like you. Clara felt the world around her grow still. She barely breathed. Alexander. It was the first time she had spoken his name aloud. Neither of them seemed to notice. I know what society will think. He continued. I know they will call me reckless. I know they will mock both of us. But I can no longer pretend that any lady in London possesses the qualities I have already found. Tears shimmered in Clara's eyes. You don't know what you're saying. I've never been more certain. He reached into his coat and withdrew a small velvet box. He did not open it. Instead, he held it gently in both hands. I'm not asking because of the inheritance. I'm not asking because you once saved my life. He smiled faintly. I'm asking because these last few weeks have reminded me what sort of man I wish to become. His eyes never left hers. And every time I imagine that future, I see you standing beside me. Clara's heart ached. She had dreamed of hearing words like these. Never from a duke. Never from anyone. Yet instead of joy, she felt fear. She slowly stepped backward. You cannot. Alexander frowned. Why? Because you don't understand what will happen. I do. No. Her voice trembled. You don't. She looked toward Beaumont House in the distance. People already whisper because we've spoken. If you marry me, they won't whisper. They'll destroy you. They'll laugh at your family. They'll insult your mother. They'll say Beaumont has become a joke. She shook her head. I couldn't bear being the reason. Alexander answered quietly. You would never be the reason. But I would. No. He stepped closer again. The reason would be their prejudice. They'll never accept me. Then they'll have to learn. She smiled sadly. You have too much faith. Alexander's expression softened. No. I have faith in you. For a moment, Clara could no longer hold back the tears. She quickly turned away. I've spent my entire life trying not to make life harder for anyone. Her voice almost broke. If I become your wife, everything becomes harder. Alexander gently moved until he stood beside her. He looked out across the stream. When I was a little boy, he said quietly, my grandfather asked me a strange question. She listened. He asked whether I knew the difference between comfort and happiness. I told him they were the same. Alexander smiled. He laughed. What did he say? He told me. Comfort asks you to avoid storms. Happiness asks you to walk through them with the right person. Clara closed her eyes. The words touched something deep inside her heart. Alexander turned toward her once more. So I'll ask only once. He slowly opened the velvet box. Inside rested a simple ring. not covered in diamonds, not extravagant. A single sapphire surrounded by tiny pearls. It had belonged to his grandmother, Clara Ashford. His voice was calm, steady, filled with hope. "Will you marry me?" The world seemed to stop. Even the wind fell silent. Clara looked at the ring, then at the man holding it. She wanted to say yes. Every part of her wanted to. But another part remembered every cruel whisper she had ever heard from noble drawing rooms. Every mocking smile. Every reminder that servants belonged downstairs. She imagined those whispers becoming headlines across London. A duke marries a maid. The Beaumont name falls. She slowly covered her mouth to stop herself from crying. "I!" Before she could answer, the sharp sound of applause echoed from the far end of the bridge. Both of them turned. Lady Eleanor Winthrop stood there. She was not alone. Behind her were 3 distinguished members of London's aristocracy, including Lord Ashcombe, one of the trustees responsible for approving Alexander's inheritance. Eleanor smiled sweetly. "My!" she said loudly enough for everyone to hear. "What a touching little performance." Alexander's face hardened. "Eleanor." She ignored him. Instead, she looked directly at Clara. "So, the rumors were true." Her smile became colder. The future Duchess of Beaumont. She let her eyes travel slowly over Clara's plain gray servant's dress. "Wears an apron." The 3 noblemen exchanged uncomfortable glances. Lord Ashcombe removed his spectacles, studying Clara with unmistakable disbelief. Lady Eleanor knew exactly what she was doing. She had arranged this meeting. She had followed Alexander. And she had brought the very men whose opinion would determine the fate of Beaumont House. The battle for Alexander's inheritance had begun. Lady Eleanor's applause faded into an uneasy silence. The autumn wind carried the last crimson leaves across the stone bridge as every eye turned toward Clara. She instinctively took a step backward. Alexander remained where he was. His expression had hardened into one Clara had never seen before. Cold. Protective. Lord Ashcombe cleared his throat. "Your Grace." He looked from Alexander to the ring still resting in the Duke's hand. "I trust there is an explanation." Alexander answered without hesitation. "There is." Lady Eleanor smiled sweetly. "I'm certain everyone would love to hear it." The other trustees exchanged nervous glances. They had expected to inspect the Duke's future bride. None of them had expected to find him proposing beside a country bridge to a servant in a plain gray dress. Alexander slowly closed the velvet ring box. Then, to everyone's surprise, he reached for Clara's trembling hand. She looked at him in shock. He gently held it, not tightly, not possessively, simply as though he wanted her to know she was no longer standing alone. "I believe introductions are in order." His voice carried the quiet authority of generations of Beaumont dukes. "This is Miss Clara Ashford, the bravest woman I have ever known." Lady Eleanor laughed softly. "How charming!" Alexander ignored her. "When I was 10 years old," he continued, "I fell into Beaumont Lake." Lord Ashcombe nodded. "I remember hearing about that accident." Alexander looked toward Clara. "Everyone remembers that I survived. Very few remember why." The trustees listened carefully. "This woman," he lifted Clara's hand slightly, "jumped into freezing water to save a frightened child she had never met. No one ordered her. No one rewarded her. She simply chose courage." The bridge fell silent. Alexander continued. "Only days ago, she entered a burning cottage to rescue another child. Again, no one ordered her. No one promised reward. She simply chose courage." Lord Ashcombe slowly looked toward Clara with new interest. Alexander wasn't finished. "She spends every Saturday teaching village children to read. She donates books she cannot afford. She visits the orphanage. She comforts the sick. She asks for nothing in return." He looked directly at the trustees. "My grandfather believed Beaumont House should stand beside people of character." His voice became even stronger. "I have searched London's grandest ballrooms. I have dined with duchesses. I have danced with princesses. I have met women wearing fortunes around their necks. Then he gently squeezed Clara's hand. I have never met anyone richer in character than Miss Clara Ashford. Even the wind seemed to pause. Lord Ashcombe lowered his eyes. For several moments, no one spoke. Lady Eleanor finally broke the silence. Character is admirable. She smiled politely. But England has traditions. Alexander met her gaze. So it does. A duke marrying a servant would invite ridicule. Perhaps. The newspapers would feast upon it. They might. The crown itself could question such a union. Alexander remained perfectly calm. What exactly are you afraid of, Lady Eleanor? She blinked. I beg your pardon? Are you afraid people will laugh? Her smile stiffened. They certainly will. Alexander looked toward the countryside surrounding them. When this village caught fire, he said quietly, not one person asked whether Clara possessed noble blood before trusting her. When children cry, they don't ask whether the hand comforting them belongs to a duchess. When a life must be saved, the river does not care about family titles. He turned back toward the trustees. Only people do. Lord Ashcombe removed his spectacles. For the first time in years, he looked uncertain. I confess, he admitted slowly, I've heard extraordinary things about Miss Ashford these past few weeks. Another trustee nodded. So have I. The villagers speak highly of her. Lady Eleanor's pleasant expression began to crack. My lords, she interrupted. Surely reputation among servants cannot replace generations of noble breeding. An older trustee who had remained silent until now finally spoke. His name was Sir Benedict Harrington. He was the oldest of the three. My dear Lady Eleanor, he said gently, I've spent 60 years judging men. He looked toward Alexander. And I've learned one lesson. Titles are inherited. He slowly turned toward Clara. Character is earned. Lady Eleanor's jaw tightened. She had expected immediate rejection. Instead, the conversation had begun slipping beyond her control. She quickly changed her approach. Very well. She folded her hands gracefully. If Miss Ashford is truly worthy, her eyes settled upon Clara. Perhaps she would answer one simple question. Clara looked up. Eleanor smiled. Tell us, if you became Duchess of Beaumont, what would you do first? The question sounded innocent, but Clara recognized the trap. If she answered selfishly, the trustees would question her motives. If she answered too modestly, they would doubt her confidence. Several long seconds passed. Finally, Clara spoke. I would listen. Everyone looked surprised. Lady Eleanor frowned. Listen. Clara nodded. To whom? The servants. The tenants. The gardeners. The cooks. The stable boys. She smiled gently. My father used to say something. What was that? A house tells you everything that is wrong. She paused. If you're willing to listen to the people who keep it standing. Even Alexander found himself smiling. Clara continued. I've worked in great houses for nearly 10 years. I've learned that servants notice things others miss. They know which families struggle through winter. They know which children need boots. They know which elderly tenants pretend not to be hungry. Her voice remained calm. If Beaumont House belongs to the people as much as the Beaumont family, she looked toward Alexander. Then I think everyone deserves to be heard. Silence. Complete silence. Lord Ashcombe slowly smiled. I believe, he said quietly, the young lady has just answered better than most politicians. A faint chuckle passed between the trustees. Alexander looked at Clara with unmistakable admiration. Not because she had impressed important men, because she had simply spoken the truth. Lady Eleanor realized she was losing, and she despised losing. Very well. If kindness would not defeat Clara, then scandal would. As everyone began walking back toward their carriages, Eleanor lingered behind with her maid. Her voice dropped to a whisper. Find Mr. Finch. Tonight. The maid nodded. My lady. Lady Eleanor's eyes remained fixed on Clara, who was laughing softly at something Alexander had just said. "If the truth cannot destroy Miss Ashford." A cold smile slowly appeared. "We shall give London a lie it cannot resist." Far above them, thunder rolled across the darkening sky. Neither Alexander nor Clara knew that the greatest test of their love would not come from poverty or prejudice, but from a carefully crafted deception that threatened to tear them apart forever. The days that followed passed with an uneasy calm. To the servants of Beaumont House, life appeared unchanged. Breakfast was served precisely at 8. The gardeners continued preparing the rose beds for winter. The blacksmith repaired broken wagon wheels. Children chased one another through the village as though nothing had happened. Only Alexander and Clara understood how quickly time was slipping away. Each sunrise brought the trustees' reception closer. Each sunset narrowed the path before them. Yet neither of them mentioned the proposal again. Not because it had been forgotten, because both knew the answer would change everything. 3 mornings later, London awoke to scandal. By breakfast, copies of the Morning Chronicle were already circulating through drawing rooms, gentlemen's clubs, and fashionable cafes. The headline stretched boldly across the front page. "Is the Duke of Beaumont to marry a servant?" Below it were lines filled with speculation. Some claimed the Duke had lost his senses after the recent fire. Others suggested he had been manipulated by an ambitious maid. One anonymous source even hinted that Clara had deliberately placed herself near the Duke to secure his affection. By noon, half of London believed the story. By evening, everyone had an opinion. Mrs. Holloway slammed the newspaper onto the kitchen table. "Nonsense." One of the younger maids cautiously picked it up. "They've written terrible things." Clara quietly took the paper. Her eyes moved slowly across every sentence. "The mysterious Miss Ashford has reportedly gained unusual influence over the financially troubled Duke. Several prominent families question whether gratitude has clouded His Grace's judgment. Society anxiously awaits confirmation." Not once did the article mention the orphanage, the village school, the burning cottage, the child she had rescued. Only gossip, only suspicion. Clara carefully folded the newspaper. "They don't know me." Mrs. Holloway looked at her with concern. "But they think they do." That afternoon, Alexander stormed into his solicitor's office carrying the same newspaper. Mr. Carlyle barely had time to stand before the Duke placed it upon his desk. "Who spoke to the press?" The old solicitor adjusted his spectacles. "I've been asking the same question all morning." Alexander's jaw tightened. "This article was written by someone who wanted to damage Miss Ashford." Mr. Carlyle nodded. "I believe so." Alexander paced across the room. "They call her calculating. They call her ambitious. They've never met her." The solicitor quietly waited until the Duke stopped pacing. "May I offer one observation?" Alexander nodded. "They are not attacking Miss Ashford." "No, they are attacking your decision." Alexander frowned. "What do you mean?" "The easiest way to weaken a man," Mr. Carlyle said quietly, "is to convince him that protecting someone he loves will only hurt her." Alexander froze. For the first time, someone else had spoken the truth aloud. Someone he loves. He had never admitted it, not even to himself. Yet hearing another person say the words, he realized he could no longer deny them. Meanwhile, in the village, Clara walked toward the school carrying another basket of books. Children waved excitedly from across the lane. But today, something was different. Several adults lowered their voices as she passed. 2 women stopped talking altogether. An elderly gentleman removed his hat politely, yet his smile seemed uncertain. The newspaper had reached the countryside. Mrs. Abbott met Clara at the school door. "I was hoping you wouldn't come." Clara looked surprised. "Why?" "The children will be delighted." The schoolmistress lowered her voice. "But some parents—" She hesitated. "Have questions." "What kind of questions?" "They've read the newspapers." Clara nodded slowly. "I understand." Mrs. Abbott quickly took her hand. "I don't believe a word of it." "I know. But children shouldn't be caught between gossip and kindness. Clara looked through the classroom window. The little faces waiting inside smiled the moment they saw her. They knew nothing about newspapers, nothing about society, nothing about scandal. They only knew Miss Clara had come to read stories. She smiled warmly. I won't disappoint them. Far away in London, Lady Eleanor watched another newspaper roll off the printing press. Mr. Finch stood beside her. The article has spread exactly as expected. Eleanor nodded. And Miss Ashford? People have begun asking questions. There is one difficulty. What? The more people investigate her, the more they seem to admire her. Eleanor's pleasant expression vanished. What? The orphanage defended her. The school defended her. The villagers defended her. He sighed. They all insist she's the kindest woman they've ever known. Lady Eleanor stared silently through the window. Kindness. Again. Always kindness. It was infuriating. You told me her birth records were incomplete. They are. Then find out why. I've tried. Try harder. Her voice became colder. I don't need the truth. I need something believable. Finch looked uncomfortable. My lady. You hired me. She interrupted sharply. Do your work. After he left, Eleanor remained alone. She looked into the mirror above the fireplace. For years she had believed beauty, wealth, and status guaranteed happiness. Yet the one man she wanted looked past every one of those things. She whispered bitterly, What does she have? That I don't. No mirror could answer. That evening, Alexander arrived unexpectedly at Ashford Manor. He found Clara sitting alone in the gardens beneath the old oak tree where they had first walked together. She held the newspaper in her lap. He immediately recognized it. I'm sorry. She looked up and smiled gently. You didn't write it. No. But someone wrote it because of me. Alexander sat beside her. For several minutes they watched the wind carry autumn leaves across the gardens. Finally Clara spoke. Do you regret asking me? Alexander turned toward her immediately. No. Not even now? Especially not now. She searched his face. Why? He smiled sadly. Because newspapers have reminded me of something. What? They know everything about titles. They know nothing about hearts. Clara laughed softly through her sadness. You always know what to say. No. He shook his head. I simply tell the truth when I'm with you. She looked down at the newspaper one last time. Then, without another word, she folded it, walked to the nearby fountain, and dropped it into the water. The ink slowly dissolved. The cruel words blurred until they disappeared completely. Alexander watched quietly. What are you thinking? Clara smiled as she looked at the fading paper. My father used to tell me something. What was it? A lie can travel around the world. She watched the last of the ink vanish beneath the water. But it can never outrun a life honestly lived. Alexander couldn't help smiling. He realized something in that moment. He no longer admired Clara merely because she was kind. He admired her because the world seemed unable to make her bitter, and that, he thought, was rarer than beauty, wealth, or even nobility. Neither of them noticed the shadow watching from the hedge beyond the garden. Mr. Finch quietly closed his notebook. He had heard every word, and the idea forming in his mind was far more dangerous than any newspaper headline. If he could not destroy Clara's reputation, perhaps he could destroy her past. The following morning dawned cold and silver over Hampshire. Mist drifted across the fields, softening the outlines of cottages and ancient oak trees. Beaumont House emerged from the fog like a sleeping giant, its towers barely visible beneath the pale autumn sky. Inside the library, Alexander had scarcely slept. The accounts lay open across his desk exactly where he had left them the previous evening, but he had not looked at them for hours. Instead, his thoughts returned again and again to Clara, to the newspaper, to the lies. A knock interrupted the silence. Enter. Thomas stepped inside carrying a leather portfolio. I've received replies from the trustees. Alexander looked up. So soon? Thomas nodded. They intend to inspect Beaumont House 3 days before the reception. Alexander frowned. Inspect. They wish to determine whether the estate has been managed responsibly. He placed several letters on the desk. And Thomas hesitated. They've requested that Miss Ashford be present. Alexander slowly stood. They wish to question her? It would appear so. Alexander's expression darkened. They have no right. They believe they do. Thomas sighed. They claim anyone who may become Duchess of Beaumont must be examined. Alexander looked toward the window. They speak as though she's applying for employment. At Ashford Manor, Clara was helping Mrs. Holloway prepare preserves for the winter. The kitchen smelled of cinnamon, apples, and fresh bread. For a little while, life felt wonderfully ordinary. Mrs. Holloway smiled as Clara carefully sealed another glass jar. You've made enough jam to feed half the county. Clara laughed. Children always eat more than we expect. They certainly do. A young servant hurried into the kitchen. Miss Clara. She looked up. Yes. A gentleman has come asking for you. Mrs. Holloway raised an eyebrow. Another one? The servant nodded. He says his name is Mr. Finch. Clara had never heard the name before. I'll see him. Mr. Bartholomew Finch waited politely beneath the great oak near the front entrance. He removed his hat as Clara approached. Miss Ashford. Good morning. I hope I'm not disturbing you. I don't believe we've met. No. He smiled pleasantly. I'm conducting historical research on several Hampshire families. Clara relaxed slightly. I see. I wondered whether you might answer a few questions. If I can. He opened a notebook. Your parents. My father was Daniel Ashford. My mother was Mary Ashford. They're both deceased. So I understand. He wrote quickly. And before Hampshire? Clara looked puzzled. My parents always lived here. Always. As far as I know. Finch nodded thoughtfully. Curious. What is? He closed the notebook. Nothing. I simply found an unusual gap in the parish records. Clara frowned. I don't understand. I'm sure it's insignificant. He smiled reassuringly. Thank you for your time. He tipped his hat and walked away. Clara watched him disappear down the lane. Something about the conversation unsettled her. Not because of the questions, but because the man had seemed disappointed by the answers. 2 days later, London. Lady Eleanor sat in the drawing room of Winthrop House while Mr. Finch placed several aged documents upon the table. I've searched every parish from Hampshire to Kent. And he removed one final sheet of paper. I found this. Eleanor leaned forward. What is it? A baptism register. She scanned the faded ink. The child listed wasn't named Clara. Instead, the entry read, Infant female, no family name recorded. The date matched Clara's birth year. No surname. Finch shook his head. The page is damaged. What does it mean? It could mean nothing. Or... He paused. The autumn sunlight filtered softly through the panes. It's beautiful. My grandmother's favorite place. Alexander poured tea. When I was a boy. He smiled. She claimed flowers listened better than people. Clara laughed. Was she right? I've often suspected so. For the first time in many days, neither spoke about newspapers, or trustees, or London. Instead, they spoke about childhood, favorite books, rainstorms, gardens. Alexander confessed that he had once tried to climb the manor roof at 12 years old. Clara admitted she had once hidden inside the library overnight because she wanted to finish reading a novel. You fell asleep there? She nodded, laughing. The butler thought the house was haunted. Alexander laughed so hard he nearly spilled his tea. The sound echoed warmly through the greenhouse. Outside, Thomas happened to pass by. He stopped for a moment. He smiled quietly to himself. He had served 3 generations of Beaumonts. He had never heard the young Duke laugh like that. As the afternoon faded toward evening, Alexander and Clara wandered through the greenhouse paths. They stopped beside a white camellia that had somehow bloomed despite the approaching winter. Clara touched one of its delicate petals. It's blooming too early. Alexander looked at it thoughtfully. Or perhaps, he smiled. It's blooming exactly when it was meant to. She looked at him. Their eyes met. For several heartbeats, neither moved. Then Alexander reached gently for her hand. This time, she didn't pull away. She looked down at their joined hands before smiling shyly. I've been afraid, she admitted quietly. I know. I'm still afraid. So am I. She looked surprised. You? He laughed softly. Terrified. Of what? Losing you. The words hung between them. Simple. Honest. True. Clara felt tears gather once again. Very slowly, she rested her other hand over his. I don't know what tomorrow will bring, she whispered. But, she finally looked directly into his eyes. I know what my heart has been trying to tell me. Alexander barely breathed. She smiled through happy tears. Yes. His eyes widened. Yes. She nodded. Yes, Alexander. I will marry you. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The world itself seemed to disappear. Alexander laughed. A joyful, relieved laugh that filled the greenhouse. Then, with gentle hands, he opened the velvet box once more. He slipped his grandmother's sapphire ring onto Clara's finger. Fit perfectly. The fading sunlight caught the blue stone, making it sparkle like the surface of Beaumont Lake on a summer morning. Alexander lifted her hand and kissed it softly. Thank you. Clara smiled through tears. No, she whispered. Thank you for seeing me. Hidden just beyond the greenhouse doors, concealed behind climbing ivy, a pair of watchful eyes witnessed everything. Lady Eleanor's maid quietly lowered the opera glasses she had been using. She hurried toward the waiting carriage. Within the hour, Lady Eleanor would know that Clara Ashford had accepted the Duke's proposal, and before dawn, she would set the cruelest part of her plan into motion. For the first time in many years, Beaumont House felt alive. The news of the engagement had not yet reached London, but within the estate walls, those who had served the Beaumont family for decades noticed the change immediately. Alexander walked with a lighter step. He greeted gardeners by name. He stopped to speak with stable boys. He even joined the kitchen staff for breakfast, leaving Mrs. Holloway so astonished that she nearly dropped an entire tray of fresh scones. Thomas watched the transformation with quiet satisfaction. It seems, he remarked one morning, that happiness agrees with your grace. Alexander smiled. I believe it does. Clara, however, found it harder to celebrate. She stood before the bedroom mirror Lady Margaret had lent her, studying the sapphire ring on her finger. It glittered beautifully, yet every time she admired it, she remembered the whispers that would soon follow. A gentle knock interrupted her thoughts. Come in. Lady Margaret entered carrying a long, carefully wrapped package. I thought you might need this. Clara accepted it. What is it? Open it. She slowly untied the ribbon. Inside rested an elegant ivory gown. Its silk was simple rather than extravagant, decorated only with delicate embroidery along the sleeves. Clara stared in amazement. My lady! It's beautiful. It belonged to my daughter. Lady Margaret's smile carried both warmth and sorrow. She passed away before she ever had the chance to wear it. Clara immediately closed the box. I cannot. You can. Lady Margaret gently placed a hand over hers. My daughter believed clothing should make a woman feel confident. She looked into Clara's eyes. I think she would be honored. Tears welled in Clara's eyes. I don't know how to thank you. You already have. Lady Margaret smiled. You've reminded an old woman that hope still exists. 3 days later, the grand inspection arrived. Every servant had spent the previous week preparing Beaumont House. Silver gleamed beneath polished chandeliers. Fireplaces burned brightly. Gardens had been trimmed with meticulous care. Even the ancient grandfather clock in the entrance hall had been repaired after remaining silent for nearly a decade. At precisely 11 o'clock, 6 elegant carriages rolled through the gates. The trustees had arrived. Behind them came several respected members of London's aristocracy, journalists, solicitors, and, to Alexander's surprise, Lady Eleanor Winthrop. She stepped gracefully from her carriage wearing a deep burgundy gown and a smile so pleasant that no stranger could have guessed the bitterness hidden beneath it. Thomas quietly approached Alexander. "Everything is ready." Alexander nodded. "I hope so." The inspection began. The trustees examined ledgers. They questioned estate managers. They toured the farms. They spoke with tenants. Hours passed. To Alexander's relief, the reports were overwhelmingly positive. Lord Ashcombe smiled as they crossed the dairy farm. "I've inspected estates twice as wealthy that were managed far worse." Sir Benedict nodded. "Your tenants seem genuinely loyal." Alexander answered simply, "They've earned my loyalty first." The elderly trustee smiled. "A sensible philosophy." Lady Eleanor listened in silence. Nothing seemed to be going wrong. Nothing. Which meant it was time. Late that afternoon, everyone gathered inside Beaumont House's magnificent ballroom. Long tables displayed the estate's financial records. Servants quietly served tea while conversations echoed beneath crystal chandeliers. Lord Ashcombe rose. "There remains one final matter." Every voice fell silent. "The future Duchess of Beaumont." Alexander stood. "I have already made my decision." "So we've heard." Lord Ashcombe smiled politely. "Would you introduce the lady?" Alexander turned toward the ballroom entrance. The great doors slowly opened. Every conversation stopped. Clara entered. She wore Lady Margaret's ivory gown. Her hair was arranged simply. The sapphire engagement ring sparkled softly beneath the chandeliers. No diamonds. No jeweled tiara. Only quiet grace. Several noble ladies exchanged surprised glances. She was undeniably beautiful. Not because of expensive jewels, but because she carried herself with calm dignity. Alexander crossed the room toward her. Without hesitation, he offered his arm. Clara accepted it. Together they walked toward the trustees. Lord Ashcombe bowed politely. "Miss Ashford." She curtsied. "My lord, I understand congratulations are in order." "Thank you." Before another word could be spoken, a voice echoed from the rear of the ballroom. "I fear congratulations may be somewhat premature." Everyone turned. Mr. Bartholomew Finch stepped forward carrying a leather document case. Lady Eleanor remained seated. She hid her satisfaction behind an expression of polite curiosity. Finch bowed. "My lords, I regret interrupting, but information has recently come into my possession." Alexander's eyes narrowed. "What information?" Finch slowly removed several aged documents. "I have reason to believe," he paused dramatically, "that Miss Clara Ashford has concealed her true identity." The ballroom erupted into whispers. Clara looked utterly confused. "I don't understand." Finch lifted the papers. "The woman standing before you may not be Clara Ashford by birth." Silence. Complete silence. Alexander stepped forward. "Explain yourself." "The parish records surrounding Miss Ashford's birth are incomplete." Finch continued. "I have uncovered evidence suggesting she was adopted." Gasps spread across the ballroom. Lady Eleanor lowered her eyes to hide a smile. Finch wasn't finished. "If her parentage cannot be established." He looked toward the trustees. "How can anyone know who she truly is?" The room buzzed with speculation. Some guests whispered about illegitimacy. Others mentioned scandal. A few quietly stepped farther away from Clara. She stood frozen. Her hands trembled. She looked toward Alexander. "I." Her voice broke. "I never knew." Alexander saw genuine confusion in her eyes. She wasn't pretending. She truly had no idea. Lord Ashcombe spoke carefully. "Miss Ashford, were you aware of this?" She slowly shook her head. "No, my lord. My parents never spoke of such a thing." Finch folded his hands. "Convenient." Alexander's patience snapped. "Enough." His voice thundered across the ballroom. Every whisper ceased instantly. He walked directly toward Finch. "You accuse an honorable woman using incomplete records and speculation." Finch remained composed. "I merely present facts." "No." Alexander replied firmly. You present uncertainty dressed as certainty. He turned toward the assembled guests. I have known Miss Ashford's heart. He looked back at Finch. You claim to know only missing pages. The contrast between the two men could not have been greater. One defended a person's life. The other attacked a mystery. Yet the damage had already begun. As Clara looked around the ballroom, she saw doubt spreading across faces that had smiled at her only moments earlier. For the first time since accepting Alexander's proposal, fear truly entered her heart. And somewhere among the watching crowd, an elderly housekeeper suddenly turned pale. She stared at Clara as though she had seen a ghost. Then she whispered to herself, "It cannot be." But those eyes. The old woman knew something about Clara's past. Something no one else in the room had yet discovered. The ballroom remained utterly silent. No one moved. No one even seemed willing to breathe. The elderly housekeeper slowly rose from her chair near the back of the room, her hands trembling so violently that she nearly dropped the silver tray she had been carrying. Thomas noticed immediately. Mrs. Beatrice? The old woman did not answer. Her eyes remained fixed on Clara. Tears had already begun to gather. It can't be, she whispered again. Alexander turned toward her. Mrs. Beatrice? She had served Beaumont House for over 50 years. She had cared for Alexander's father as a child. No one questioned her honesty. She slowly walked forward through the crowd. Each step seemed to carry the weight of decades. When she finally reached Clara, she looked carefully into her face. Then, very gently, she touched the small silver locket Clara always wore beneath her collar. Clara looked surprised. You know this? Mrs. Beatrice's voice shook. I polished this locket. She swallowed hard. 24 years ago. The ballroom erupted into confused murmurs. Alexander frowned. What are you saying? The old housekeeper looked at him with tear-filled eyes. I remember the night. What night? The great storm. Mrs. Beatrice slowly sat down, her strength almost gone. Thomas brought her a chair. The trustees listened intently. Even Mr. Finch looked curious. Lady Eleanor's confident smile began to fade. The old woman closed her eyes for a moment. It was 24 years ago. The river flooded after 3 days of rain. Roads disappeared beneath the water. Bridges collapsed. She looked toward Clara. A carriage came to Beaumont House just after midnight. Inside, there was a young couple carrying a newborn baby. Alexander listened carefully. I had never seen them before. The gentleman said they had been attacked by highwaymen. The baby was sick. They begged for shelter. Mrs. Beatrice's voice became quieter. The old Duke welcomed them immediately, as he always did. She smiled faintly through her tears. He never turned anyone away. The ballroom remained completely silent. They stayed only one night. The next morning, they were gone. Alexander frowned. Gone. Mrs. Beatrice nodded. The carriage had disappeared. So had the parents. The nursery where the baby had slept, she paused, was empty. Clara instinctively touched her locket. Mrs. Beatrice looked at it. Except the baby's blanket remained. And that locket. Alexander looked toward Clara. You've had that locket all your life? She nodded. My mother told me never to remove it. Mrs. Beatrice slowly reached into her apron pocket. I've kept something all these years. With trembling hands, she unfolded a faded piece of blue cloth. The embroidery was worn with age, but one corner still showed a tiny silver swallow stitched into the fabric. Clara gasped. My blanket! Mrs. Beatrice nodded. The old Duke kept it. He believed one day someone might return looking for the child. The old woman looked toward the trustees. He ordered me to preserve it. Alexander stared in disbelief. My grandfather never told anyone? He believed. Mrs. Beatrice smiled sadly. That if the child survived, she deserved the chance to choose her own life. Mr. Finch stepped forward. Interesting. But none of this proves Miss Ashford is that child. Mrs. Beatrice slowly turned toward him. No, it doesn't. But there's something else. She looked directly at Clara. My dear, would you mind showing everyone the back of your left shoulder? Clara blinked. My shoulder? You have a birthmark. Clara looked surprised. How did you know? Mrs. Beatrice smiled through tears. The little baby had one. Alexander looked uncertain. My lords. Lord Ashcombe nodded respectfully. If Miss Ashford is comfortable. Clara hesitated only briefly. Lady Margaret quietly stepped beside her. I'll help. The two women disappeared into the adjoining room. Several anxious minutes passed. The ballroom buzzed with whispers. Lady Eleanor folded her hands tightly. This proves nothing, she whispered to herself. It proves nothing. Finally, the doors opened again. Lady Margaret returned first. Her face was pale. Clara followed. Lady Margaret looked toward the trustees. It's true. Mrs. Beatrice slowly stood. What shape? Lady Margaret answered softly. A swallow. The old housekeeper burst into tears. I knew it. I knew those eyes. The ballroom fell silent once more. Mrs. Beatrice looked at Alexander. The old Duke commissioned that embroidery because of the birthmark. He joked that the child carried Beaumont's lucky swallow upon her shoulder. Alexander frowned. Why Beaumont? Mrs. Beatrice hesitated. I never asked. The old Duke simply smiled. And said. She closed her eyes, remembering words spoken nearly a quarter of a century earlier. One day this little swallow will find her way home. Those words echoed through the ballroom. Even Mr. Finch no longer looked certain. But Lady Eleanor refused to surrender. She stood gracefully. How touching! Her voice remained calm. But stories are not evidence. She looked toward the trustees. We still have no proof of Miss Ashford's birth. No proof of her family. No proof of who she truly is. Alexander started to answer, but another voice interrupted from the ballroom entrance. There may be. Everyone turned. An elderly gentleman stood in the doorway, leaning upon an ebony cane. His silver hair framed a weathered but distinguished face. Thomas gasped. Dr. Edmund Hawthorne. The elderly physician slowly entered the room. I was Beaumont's family doctor. He looked toward Clara. And, his eyes filled with emotion, I delivered that child into this world. Every person in the ballroom stood frozen. Lady Eleanor's face lost all color. Dr. Hawthorne held a worn leather journal against his chest. I've spent 24 years wondering what became of her. He looked at Clara with unmistakable tenderness. I never imagined I would live long enough to see her again. The journal in his hands contained a truth that had been hidden for nearly a quarter of a century. A truth that would not only change Clara's life, but reveal a secret so astonishing that even Alexander's grandfather had taken it to his grave. Dr. Edmund Hawthorne walked slowly toward the center of the ballroom. The guests instinctively stepped aside, creating a silent path before him. Though age had bent his shoulders, there remained a quiet dignity about him that commanded respect. Alexander immediately offered him a chair. Doctor, please. The old physician smiled gratefully. You've grown into your grandfather's kindness. Alexander looked at the worn leather journal in the doctor's hands. You said you delivered Clara into this world. I did. Every eye in the ballroom fixed upon him. Lady Eleanor remained perfectly still. Her confident smile had disappeared. Dr. Hawthorne carefully opened the journal. The pages were yellowed with age. Their ink faded but still perfectly legible. I kept records of every birth I attended. He turned several pages. I never expected these notes to matter. His finger stopped on one entry. There. He adjusted his spectacles. October the 17th. During a violent autumn storm. He read slowly. A healthy daughter was born to Daniel and Mary Ashford. Clara's eyes widened. My parents. The doctor nodded. Yes, they were your parents. Mr. Finch frowned. Then why were the parish records incomplete? Dr. Hawthorne smiled sadly. Because the church burned 2 months later. Several guests looked surprised. The old parish chapel caught fire during winter. Many records were destroyed. Lord Ashcombe nodded thoughtfully. I remember hearing of that. The doctor continued. Fortunately, he gently tapped the journal. I kept my own. Mr. Finch lowered his eyes. His strongest argument had vanished. Lady Eleanor quietly clenched her gloves. The doctor wasn't finished. Your parents were honest people. He looked toward Clara. Your father worked as a carpenter. Your mother taught reading to village children. Clara smiled through tears. She did. Every Thursday afternoon. The old physician chuckled softly. She used to say books were windows for people who could not travel. Clara covered her mouth. She had said nearly those exact words to children at the village school only days earlier. Without realizing it, she had carried her mother's wisdom her entire life. The doctor closed the journal. I visited your parents often. They loved you dearly, more than life itself. Tears rolled quietly down Clara's cheeks. So, she whispered, I was never abandoned. No, the doctor's voice was gentle. Never. Then, she struggled to speak. Why couldn't I remember any of this? You were only an infant. He smiled kindly. Memory begins later. Lady Margaret quietly embraced Clara. You always belonged. Clara buried her face against the older woman's shoulder, overwhelmed by relief. Mr. Finch slowly removed his spectacles. He hesitated. It appears I reached the wrong conclusion. Alexander looked directly at him. No, you reached the conclusion someone wished you to reach. The investigator lowered his head. He knew exactly whom the Duke meant. All eyes turned toward Lady Eleanor. She remained composed. I merely requested an investigation. Alexander's voice remained calm. You requested suspicion. I requested truth. No. He took one step toward her. You requested doubt. Silence spread through the ballroom. Lady Eleanor realized she had lost. But pride refused to let her surrender quietly. She lifted her chin. I acted to protect Beaumont. Alexander answered gently. Beaumont never needed protection from Clara. His eyes never left hers. It needed protection from prejudice. No one defended Lady Eleanor. Not even her own father. The room had quietly chosen its side. Lord Ashcombe rose from his chair. I believe we have heard enough. The other trustees nodded. He walked toward Clara. Miss Ashford. She looked up. I owe you an apology. My lord. I allowed rumors to cloud my judgment. He bowed his head. I should have sought truth before entertaining gossip. Clara smiled gently. Apology accepted. Lord Ashcombe smiled. You make forgiveness seem remarkably easy. My father always said resentment is heavier than forgiveness. The elderly trustee laughed quietly. I suspect your father was a wiser man than many members of Parliament. Even the guests chuckled. The tension that had filled the ballroom slowly dissolved. Sir Benedict Harrington stood next. I have one final question. Alexander nodded. Of course. The elderly trustee looked first at Alexander, then at Clara. If Beaumont House were to lose every acre tomorrow, if the title disappeared, if all that remained was the man, he looked toward Clara. Would your answer still be yes? The ballroom became perfectly still. Every nobleman, every servant, every guest waited. Clara slowly walked toward Alexander. She took both of his hands, then smiled. I fell in love with the man who carried water into a burning village. She looked into his eyes. Not the Duke who owned the village. Alexander felt emotion catch in his throat. She continued softly. I would rather spend my life in a small cottage with a kind husband than in the grandest palace beside a stranger. There wasn't a dry eye in the room. Even Thomas quietly wiped his glasses. Sir Benedict smiled warmly. I believe. He looked toward the other trustees. We have our answer. The three trustees exchanged silent glances. Then, one by one, they nodded. Lord Ashcombe stepped forward. Alexander Beaumont. He spoke formally. On behalf of the Beaumont Trust, We unanimously recognize Miss Clara Ashford as your lawful future Duchess. The ballroom erupted into applause. Servants cheered openly. Lady Margaret cried without shame. Mrs. Holloway hugged 3 kitchen maids at once. Thomas smiled more broadly than anyone had ever seen. Alexander looked only at Clara. Nothing else existed. He gently slipped the sapphire ring fully into place. Then, before all of London's nobility, he kissed her forehead. Not as a display, not for applause. Simply because, after weeks of uncertainty, he finally knew they would face the future together. Yet high above the ballroom, hidden on the second-floor gallery, a lone figure watched the celebration before quietly slipping away into the shadows. It was Lady Eleanor. Her plan had failed. But as she disappeared into the darkness, she whispered one final promise to herself. This isn't over. And though neither she nor anyone else knew it, fate had already begun preparing a lesson that would change even Lady Eleanor's heart before the story reached its end. The applause continued long after the trustees announced their decision. For a brief, shining moment, Beaumont House felt brighter than it had in generations. Servants embraced one another without concern for etiquette. The gardeners shook hands with stable boys. Even the stern butler, Mr. Hargreaves, whose face rarely betrayed emotion, quietly removed his spectacles to wipe away a tear. Thomas leaned toward him with a smile. I've served this family for 40 years. So have I. I've never seen Beaumont House happier. Nor have I. Alexander and Clara quietly slipped away from the crowded ballroom. Neither wished to become the center of endless congratulations. They found themselves once again in the old greenhouse where Alexander had first given her his grandmother's sapphire ring. Evening had settled over the estate. Hundreds of candles reflected softly through the glass walls, while the last rays of sunset painted the sky with deep shades of orange and violet. For several moments, they simply stood together. Finally, Clara laughed. Alexander looked surprised. What is it? I've been wondering something. What? She smiled. Do you realize we've barely had a proper conversation since becoming engaged? Alexander laughed. I believe you're right. Every time we begin talking, she counted on her fingers. A fire, a newspaper, a scandal, a ballroom, a mysterious doctor. Alexander shook his head. We do seem to attract unusual afternoons. She smiled warmly. I rather hope married life is quieter. I hope not. She looked puzzled. No, I wouldn't mind fewer scandals. He grinned. But I'd like to keep the adventures. She laughed again. The sound echoed beautifully through the greenhouse. A few moments later, Alexander became thoughtful. Clara. She looked toward him. I owe you an apology. For what? I asked you to marry me before asking something much more important. What could possibly be more important? He smiled gently. What kind of life do you want? She blinked. No one has ever asked me that. Then I'm asking now. She walked slowly along the greenhouse path, trailing her fingers across blooming roses. When I was little, she began quietly, I used to imagine living in a house filled with books. Alexander listened carefully. I imagined children running through long hallways, a kitchen that always smelled of fresh bread, a garden where anyone who felt lonely could sit. She smiled shyly. It sounds rather ordinary. Alexander shook his head. It sounds wonderful. She looked toward him. What about you? He laughed softly. I used to dream of traveling the world. And now, he looked around the greenhouse. Now I think I'd rather spend the rest of my life making one corner of England worthy of the people who live in it. Their eyes met. For the first time, they weren't speaking as a duke and his future duchess. They were simply two people dreaming about the same future. The following morning, word of the engagement spread across Hampshire faster than anyone imagined. Church bells rang in 3 neighboring villages. The Wilson family arrived carrying baskets of fresh apples. The children from the village school proudly presented Clara with a handmade bouquet tied together with blue ribbon. Little Emily, whose life Clara had saved from the fire, stepped forward carrying a folded piece of paper. I made this. Clara unfolded it carefully. It was a child's drawing. Two people stood beneath a large oak tree holding hands. Above them, a little swallow flew through the sky. Emily pointed proudly. "That's you. And that's the Duke." Clara smiled. "And the bird?" Emily grinned. "The lucky swallow." Clara felt tears fill her eyes. She carefully folded the drawing. "I shall keep this forever." Alexander smiled beside her. "I believe it belongs in Beaumont House. It belongs wherever children are loved." Alexander looked at the drawing again. "Then perhaps," he smiled, "it belongs in every room." Not everyone celebrated. Inside Winthrop House, Lady Eleanor sat alone before the fireplace. The newspapers that once printed her opinions now praised Clara's courage. Every article carried the same message. The future Duchess wins trustees through character. Village heroine captures Beaumont's heart. A love match defies society. Lady Eleanor tossed another newspaper into the flames. Her maid quietly entered. "My lady, there is a visitor. I've no wish to receive anyone. It's your father." Lord Winthrop entered without waiting. He closed the door behind him. For several moments, neither spoke. Finally, he broke the silence. "I know." Lady Eleanor lowered her eyes. "I'm sorry." He sighed heavily. "I did not raise you to destroy another woman's happiness." Tears slowly appeared in Eleanor's eyes. "I only wanted," she struggled to continue, "to be chosen." Her father's expression softened. "My dear." He sat beside her. "Being chosen is not the same as being loved." She quietly began to cry. "I've spent years believing titles were everything." He gently took her hand. "And now," she looked into the fire, "now I think I never understood what mattered at all." A week later, Beaumont Chapel stood decorated with white roses, autumn ivy, and hundreds of candles. News of the wedding had spread far beyond Hampshire. Not because England had gained another duchess, but because people wished to witness something they believed almost impossible. A marriage built upon respect instead of convenience. Villagers lined the pathways leading toward the chapel. Servants stood proudly beside noble guests. For one day, no one cared who had been born into which family. Inside the chapel, Alexander waited before the altar. Thomas adjusted his collar one final time. "You look nervous." "I am." Thomas smiled. "Good." Alexander looked puzzled. "Why?" "Because men who understand the importance of today usually make the best husbands." Alexander laughed quietly. "I shall remember that." The chapel doors slowly opened. Every guest stood. Sunlight poured through the stained-glass windows. Clara entered on Lady Margaret's arm. She wore the same ivory gown. No crown. No extravagant jewels. Only the sapphire ring and the silver swallow locket she had worn since childhood. Alexander forgot to breathe. Thomas leaned over and whispered, "I believe your grace has forgotten every word the priest is about to say." Alexander smiled without looking away. "I believe you're right." As Clara reached the altar, Lady Margaret gently kissed her forehead. "I've always wanted a daughter." Clara embraced her tightly. "You've had one for years." Lady Margaret quietly wept. The ceremony began. When the priest asked Alexander if he would cherish Clara through prosperity and hardship alike, he answered without hesitation, "I already have." Soft laughter spread through the chapel. When Clara was asked the same question, she smiled at Alexander. "I chose the man long before I understood the title." Even the priest smiled. Moments later, they were husband and wife. Outside, church bells rang across the valley. The villagers cheered. Children scattered flower petals across the path. Mrs. Wilson embraced Mrs. Holloway. Thomas shook Alexander's hand before unexpectedly pulling him into a hug. "I served your grandfather," he said through tears. "I believe today." He looked toward Clara. He would finally know Beaumont House is safe. Alexander looked toward the sky. "So do I." 1 year later, spring returned to Hampshire with gentle rain and fields covered in wildflowers. The harsh winter had passed, leaving Beaumont estate greener than anyone could remember. From the balcony of Beaumont House, Clara watched the morning sun spread across the valley. A year earlier she had stood on that same balcony wondering whether she would ever belong. Now, the servants no longer called her the servant who became Duchess. To them, she was simply Her Grace Clara, not because of the title, because she had never forgotten who she had been. Life at Beaumont House had changed in quiet ways. Every Monday morning, the great dining room became a meeting hall. Farmers sat beside accountants, gardeners beside estate managers, kitchen maids beside housekeepers. Anyone with an idea to improve the estate was welcome. Alexander had once joked that Beaumont House held more meetings than Parliament. Clara simply smiled. People support what they help create. And they did. The harvest that year became the largest in nearly 2 decades. The estate's debts were shrinking faster than anyone had believed possible. Not through impossible luck, but because hundreds of people finally felt the estate belonged to them as much as it belonged to the Duke. The village school had doubled in size. Where once there had been a single classroom, there were now 3. Every child received books without charge. A small library stood beside the entrance with shelves built by local carpenters. Above the doorway hung a simple wooden sign, the Mary Ashford School. When Clara first saw it, she quietly cried. Alexander slipped his hand into hers. Your mother taught children without asking for payment. He smiled. I thought England should remember her. Clara leaned her head against his shoulder. She would have been proud of you. I hope, Alexander answered softly. She would have been proud of us. Emily, the little girl rescued from the cottage fire, had become the school's most enthusiastic reader. One afternoon she ran into the library holding a thick history book. Duchess Clara. Clara looked up from helping younger children. What is it? I finished this one. So quickly. Emily nodded proudly. Do you have another? Clara laughed. I believe I always shall. Watching from the doorway, Alexander smiled. Thomas joined him. I've never seen children so excited about books. Alexander folded his arms. Neither had I. Thomas glanced toward Clara. She has a remarkable gift. Alexander nodded. She makes people believe they're capable of more than they imagined. The orphanage had changed as well. Its leaking roof had been repaired. Warm fireplaces burned in every room. No child went to bed hungry. One of the older boys approached Clara during her monthly visit. Your Grace. Yes. Is it true you used to work in a kitchen? Clara smiled. I certainly did. He looked surprised. But you're a duchess. I am. Then. He frowned thoughtfully. Can someone become anything? Clara knelt until they were eye to eye. If they're willing to work. She smiled. And if they remember to be kind along the way. The boy grinned. I think I'd like to become a doctor. Dr. Hawthorne, now happily retired, happened to overhear the conversation. He chuckled. Then you'd better begin studying immediately. The boy laughed. So I shall. Not far away, Lady Eleanor Winthrop stood outside the orphanage gates. She had come quietly, without servants, without an expensive carriage, only carrying several baskets filled with books and blankets. She hesitated before entering. Clara noticed her first. For a brief moment, neither woman spoke. Finally, Eleanor lowered her eyes. I don't expect forgiveness. Clara waited. I came because... She took a deep breath. I finally understand how much harm envy can do. Silence lingered between them. Then Clara smiled gently. Would you like to help us distribute the books? Lady Eleanor blinked. You're inviting me inside? Children care very little about yesterday's mistakes. A small smile appeared on Eleanor's face. Neither woman mentioned the past again. Sometimes, the greatest apology is a changed life. That evening, Beaumont House hosted its annual spring festival. Villagers filled the gardens with music, laughter, and dancing. Long tables overflowed with homemade bread, roasted vegetables, fresh pies, and warm cider. Alexander stood beside Clara beneath the old oak tree where so much of their story had begun. The estate looks different, he said quietly. Clara smiled. No, it feels different. Alexander nodded. You're right. Mrs. Holloway approached carrying a small basket. For you. Inside lay the first roses of spring. Clara looked surprised. They're beautiful. Mrs. Holloway smiled. The gardeners asked me to tell you something. What? They've renamed the white rose. Clara laughed. You can hardly rename flowers. They already have. Alexander looked amused. What are they calling it? Mrs. Holloway smiled warmly. The Clara Rose. Everyone laughed. As sunset painted the valley in shades of gold, Alexander and Clara wandered toward the stone bridge where he had first asked for her hand. The stream still flowed gently beneath it. Birds circled overhead. Among them, a single swallow. Clara watched it soar into the evening sky. My father always believed swallows brought people home. Alexander slipped an arm gently around her. I think he was right. They stood together without speaking. The estate stretched peacefully before them. Children laughed somewhere beyond the gardens. Church bells echoed faintly across the hills. For a long while, neither wished to break the silence. Finally Clara spoke. Do you remember what you asked me here? Alexander smiled. I asked whether you would marry me. She shook her head. No, you asked something else. He looked puzzled. What was that? She smiled. You asked what kind of life I wanted. And now, she looked across the valley. I think we're living it. Alexander gently kissed her forehead. So do I. High above them, the swallow disappeared into the glowing evening sky. Beaumont House stood not as a symbol of wealth, but as proof that kindness can outlast prejudice, that courage can overcome fear, and that the strongest foundations are never built from stone alone, but from compassion, honesty, and love. The end.